What's up, guys? Well, I'm here with Christine Thompson, the mastermind behind the finish over here, right?
Say that.
Well, I would. I mean, like me, her work speaks for itself. And, you know, sorry, but I lost some footage at the beginning, so we thought it would be fun just to do a recap and an overview on how we got the raw wood to its final finish here. Right, Chris?
All right. Well, I thought it might be fun just to kind of review how we sort of came to the idea of what we were going to do with this piece. And when Tommy came to me and asked me if I'd be interested in refinishing, or not refinishing, but putting a finish on his masterpiece here, I sort of felt like it was a wonderful opportunity for me to use my interest in antique varnishes.
Now, Chris, you've never really done new work. Chris is a restoration professional, right? I mean, that's what you do, right?
I mostly do restoration work.
From museums and whatever. So this was kind of like a fun collaboration because it was something new for you to do as well, right?
Right. That's why. Then that's the other reason I took it is because I never get to do new stuff. So this was really exciting. I also for years have had a really strong interest in period varnishes, and so I thought, well, this would be a wonderful opportunity to recreate a varnish from the 18th century on this piece. And this piece, the style of this piece dates from the third quarter or so of the 18th century. And there's a lot of literature out there describing the varnishes that were used, and there are recipes that you can actually replicate and make these varnishes just like they were making in the period. And generally, the idea behind a varnish in the 18th century was that they wanted a nice, shiny, sort of thick-looking surface to show off the wood, but at the same time be protected. Typical varnishes of the 18th century, or typical furniture finishes of the 18th century were beeswax, which was very common.
Yep. You guys use that on the blanket chest.
Right. And still, it makes a really nice, wonderful, soft finish.
Pretty durable finish.
It's very easy to repair. If it starts to get a little water spot on it or something, it's very easy just to rub more beeswax on and make it look good.
It was readily available.
Right. And that was probably one of the most common finishes on 18th century furniture, particularly in the more rural areas where you didn't get access to trade items in the cities.
Yeah,
but in the cities, there were, varnishes had components that were imported. They had various tree resins like sandrak, mastic, damar was one, copal was a very popular tree resin that was being imported from the east and brought first to Europe and then to America.
Did they have different colors on them? Like each one of these resins?
They
or was it
vary,
kind of
they all kind of had these are all sort of tree resins, and they all tend to have this sort of brownish color.
Okay.
Copal is an interesting one because it's very, very hard and glassy. And when it's mixed in a varnish with oil and melted, it produces a surface that is just practically bulletproof. It's so hard, And that was a desirable thing in those days,
Because you could see a reflection in a lot of that stuff,
right?
And before this time, they really had no way to see what they look like outside of, the water and some polished wood. I mean,
polished metal every once in a while.
That's why, we opted to go with this mirror because this would have been a really higher style of finish like that. What did you just call it?
The copal varnish.
Maybe people just like the way that they looked and
Well, when you think of what it was really like in those times, there was no plastics, there were no bright colors except for certain textiles. Things were not so bright.
Kind of bleak, right?
Kind of bleak. Sometimes I try to think what it would have been like in the 18th century.
Forget
I wonder.
No way.
And to have something shiny was a really wonderful thing.
Like a tree.
And also, you knew that it enhanced the figure of the wood and made it look more elegant or whatever. Oftentimes, and this was something that we explored when we initially did a number of tests on pieces of wood that Tommy supplied me with so that we could try some of these replicated varnishes. Unfortunately, I didn't bring them with me today, but we'll have to save it for another time. But one of the things that was done in the 18th century, which I always thought was really odd, was they would take beautiful mahogany, and when it came time to finish it, they would stain it red with a dye.
Yeah.
Okay,
like
so it was even redder. And the dye often was logwood, which was the bark of a tree that was shaved and soaked in water, and actually this red dye leached out, and you could use that. These are the same dyes that were also used in fabric dyeing as well. But they were often used in wood. Sometimes even brick dust, that kind of reddish dust, was used to brush onto the surface to fill the pores, and again give a more red look to the surface. So we actually experimented around with a lot of bright reds, and everybody was sort of taken aback at first.
Especially
but
me.
Believe it or not, this finish here is actually, the first stain layer on it is quite red.
Yeah,
and we decided we wanted to push it a little more beyond what its natural color was, because we wanted to give the suggestion of this 18th century varnish.
Yeah. Without going over the top.
Right.
My fear was that it was just going to be way too red for modern day tastes.
Right,
so,
well, we had to temper that a little bit, right?
I think
we had to remember we were in the 21st century.
I know. I think it's a wonderful blend of color. And how many color applications did you have to go through before you got the base?
Well, what we did was we started out with just a dye. And what I like to do to make new wood look old is I'll take a yellow, I don't use anilines anymore, I use these more modern metal dyes that are a little more light fast. And I'll mix up a nice batch of yellow dissolved in alcohol or something. And I'll wipe down all the wood with that yellow color. And what that does is it softens and gives the effect of a more antique looking piece of wood. An older piece of wood. So this doesn't look like a brand new finished object, which is what we were trying to avoid. We didn't want to antique it or make it look distressed or make it look like it was a really old finish. We wanted to give it a nice new finish, but I didn't want that sort of raw wood look. So that's how we sort of dealt with that. The first layer was to brush this yellow coat on everything. And then the next thing we wanted to do is we wanted to enhance the grain as much as possible. And the wood of today is not quite as nice sometimes as the wood of the 18th century. And even though Tommy was able to find really fabulous wood for this thing, there were parts that needed a little sort of enhancement. And one way to do that is to use an oil-based stain to help the figure of the wood come out a little bit.
No, you did that on the drawer dividers, because these drawer dividers were different from the rest of the drawer fronts, so it didn't quite look right.
They didn't look the same.
Some pieces of it needed a little extra attention, like at the ball and claw feet were, obviously way darker when you put stain on it, and the base molding was different, and these transition pieces were different, so it must be a challenge to try to get all the pieces to blend well like that. I mean, I think that's perfect.
Well, I'll tell you how we did it. We did go ahead and stain every part of this, first of all. And then we saw those disparities. The drawer blades were too light, there were problems. So we adjusted the color. The next step after the stain was dry was to apply a coat of orange shellac. Now shellac is a typical furniture varnish today. We call it spirit varnish because it's a resin dissolved in alcohol. And it can take a dye, and it itself has a nice color to it often. And so it's a really good furniture. It really makes a nice coating for furniture today. But we decided we did not want to use a shellac varnish on this piece because it wouldn't have really been used in the period of time that it was made. We were really going for this more oil-modified resin type of look. So the shellac idea, nevertheless, we were able to take shellac, and after it was stained, we coated the whole thing with shellac. And then we stood back and we go, okay, where are the problem areas? And then when the areas that were too light, we mixed shellac and dye and then darkened them out. And so we got everything to a level of the same. And then when everything was to the level that we wanted it, we then took an alkyd-based furniture varnish.
What's alkyd-based?
Alkyd is a modern resin. And so it's basically constructed like an 18th century oil modified varnish, in that it's got a resin component and the base of it is linseed oil.
Okay.
So now the modern linseed oil resin or varnishes have an alkyd in them, and an alkyd is basically a chemical. I mean, it's a synthetic resin.
Okay.
It is created. It's very standard, but it's basically the same construction.
Now, a lot of these guys, what, at a molecular level?
Yeah.
Now, a lot of these guys in the forum, they want to know, like, it's okay to put varnish over shellac and use an alkali with this shellac? Because, I mean, I seem to get a lot of questions, and they want to know the process and what you can put together with what, you know? I wouldn't think that you could put, but I don't know, and this is one of the reasons why I don't do my own finish, guys, it's because, you know, someone like Chris has been doing it for a very long time, and who am I to say what would be best? I mean, I don't have the information or the experience, you know? So, is it possible to put varnish over shellac, no problem?
Well, I'll tell you, varnish comes in many forms, and I'll level with you. I know very little about modern finishes.
Yeah.
I do not use polyurethane on anything. I know a lot of people do, but I just don't.
Can we check the fire extinguishers?
Yeah. All right, well, we're all set. The fire extinguishers are full, and hopefully...
They're good for another year.
Hopefully. But anyways, back to polyurethane finishes, right?
Oh, okay. Anyway, I was saying that on my experience, since I don't use modern finishes in any of my work, I'm not really that familiar with them. If you read the can on a can of polyurethane, they tell you not to put it over anything other than raw wood or their particular stain.
That's right.
So it sounds like there is an issue there with polyurethane. And frankly, I wouldn't do it, you know, if they say not to do it.
Oh, no.
The alkyd varnish is another story. The beauty of this system is that we had this shellac coating between the stain and our last varnish coating.
Yeah.
And what that does is it basically makes a barrier, but I know that the alkyd varnish is compatible over shellac.
Okay.
Most things are compatible over shellac, actually.
Right? And shellac
About polyurethane, I'm not sure.
Right?
Pardon me?
You can basically put shellac over anything, yeah?
You pretty much can. I mean, the beauty of shellac is it
That's
sticks
awesome.
to anything.
It's
pretty
my hands
amazing,
when I use it.
actually.
Oh, I can't stand it.
I know it doesn't stick to anything greasy or waxy. I mean, you couldn't put shellac on that piece there because it's got wax on it now.
Yeah.
So you can't, there are certain things that are not compatible.
Yeah, I mean,
with
this has shellac. I mean, everything in my shop has shellac on it, outside that piece right there. And the only reason why it has wax on it is because it was the period finish for it.
Yeah. Well, shellac is a wonderful material. It's
Yeah.
forgiving. It can be applied in many different ways. It comes in many different colors. It's easy to repair.
Now, it
I
melts
could go on
into,
and on.
Yeah, it melts into one like layer of finish, right? Where like a sprayed acrylite, was it like what do they call it? Like a lacquer? Isn't that like separate? It doesn't melt into itself,
no,
right?
lacquer does melt into
It
itself.
does?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I don't know anything
Yeah.
about finish. That's
Yeah.
why.
In fact, lacquer, now there's a whole other world that we don't talk about so much. Lacquer, nitrocellulose lacquer finishes are not so common anymore.
Yeah.
That used to be a pretty standard furniture finish in the
Well, is it because of the
1930s,
chemicals of that,
40s, and
right?
50s. No, it's just been replaced. Well, that's partly it. The solvents are horrible.
Yeah.
Horrible. The more modern finishes are more benign, I think,
Yeah.
you know, from a health standpoint.
Yeah.
So
But anyways,
you don't see
sorry
lacquer
guys.
much anymore.
That was just for you. You know, I didn't really want to talk about that stuff, but
But anyway, that's how we got here.
yeah.
Was through this basically 5 or 6 step process. Once our 2 coats of, and we did the traditional thing, we brushed this varnish on. And I wanted a little bit of what we call ropiness.
Oh, it's
I
all
wanted
over.
to see that because I wanted it to look, I didn't want it to look sprayed. or
Yeah,
anything.
why would you?
And so our ropiness is there. In fact, if you look across in the light, you'll see those brush marks, which I really like the look of that. And the last step was to rub out this varnish, and this is where the real time-consuming part of this project was. This was hand rubbed out, first using pumice,
Really?
and then rotten stone.
Okay.
No, we don't do steel wool. We
Yeah.
do steel wool with
Yeah,
that.
I'm not a big fan of it.
And so it was first pumice and then rotten stone, and then the last coating, of course, is a nice thick coating
wax or something.
paste wax,
Okay.
good quality paste wax.
So you really put on a heavy like layer of varnish and then rubbed it out or into the fiber or whatever? Like,
I wouldn't say I put on a heavy layer, but it was
yeah.
brushing
Well,
thickness.
compared to like doing a pad finish.
And,
like
oh,
with shellac or
definitely
whatever,
thicker than a
it's
pad
way
finish.
thicker, right?
Right.
Okay, but
Yeah.
not, you didn't slap it on there.
No.
I mean, appropriately for varnish. But
No.
that's one of those things. I wouldn't know the difference between the thickness of a layer of varnish as opposed to shellac,
Well,
Because
you know,
when
you
I
can
first
brush.
saw it, I was nervous. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, it
Yeah.
looked like it was really like molasses was
Yeah.
on it,
Yeah.
and it was really, really shiny. Remember how shiny it
Yeah.
was? So, like, I didn't realize that you had to take it all down by
Yeah.
hand and pumice. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a lot
I mean,
of
you're
work.
not reducing the thickness all that much.
Yeah.
But you're reducing some of it.
Okay. No, that's awesome, Chris. I didn't know that that's what you did. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a lot of work to rub that out. Like
It's it's not a finish that I would choose to do if you were trying to save time.
that. No.
Because it's so labor intensive. And the
Yeah.
other thing is most of the surfaces have, except for inside the drawers, have 2 coatings of the alkyd varnish on
Yeah.
them. And you have to sand it out
In
between coating
Okay.
one.
And that sounds really
And you have to rough
hard.
it up, because otherwise it's not going to stick well. And that's a
Okay.
really important step. And if you don't do
All
that
right.
well enough or right enough, you're going to start having the 2 layers separate down the
Oh.
road, which we don't want.
No. Of course
So
not.
that's the other sort of labor intensive thing about
Yeah.
this.
Now,
So,
after we got the exterior of it done, I pretty much dragged it out of her shop because we decided to bring it into the Mass Historical where you just saw it, and it wasn't completed. So Chris came back today, and we're doing the interior, like the interior drawers and the interior of the case, and to see what we wanted to do for the interior of all this stuff. So I think that we're going to leave it natural, right? Because that would have been more typical.
Yeah.
I mean, at first, what I wanted to do was try to make it look dark and aged and gray, and we had some discussion. And since then, I think we've both come to the realization that that's probably not the best way to go, right?
well, it's going to age on its own.
Yeah.
It may take a few years, but I think it would look nicer in the long run if it ages on its own.
Yeah.
And this wood will darken and change color. And I think the idea of putting a finish inside the drawer, which we also talked about,
Yeah. We're still on the fence, though.
we still are on the fence,
Maybe
but
some
it was
wire.
never done in the period.
Yeah, I
so
mean, it never
my
would've been
feeling
done.
is,
Why
why
do
do
it
it
today?
now?
Yeah.
If we're trying to be sort of period appropriate.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that, outside I just clean up the dovetails, whatever, we're really, really close.
Yeah.
And hopefully the next time you see this, it will be on display at the RISD Museum. So,
Fabulous.
we're looking forward to that.
Great.
All right.